Hello and welcome to The Current Thing with me, Nick Dixon, where we talk about politics, the culture war, and anything else that comes up. But today we're doing a special edition where we're going to talk about the Bible. Talking about the Bible, kids, but hopefully it'll also be interesting to atheists because we're going to get into Genesis. We're going to look at it, hopefully in a really interesting way that anyone can relate to, even evil atheists. And with this in mind, we've brought on the most based vicar in the land. It's the Reverend Jamie Franklin, back on the show. Thanks for doing this, Jamie.
Back on the show, yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Nick. I'm honoured to receive from you the title of most based vicar in the land. There are other based vicars around for sure, so it's a real honour for me. And I did wind up some atheists last time I was on the show. We only saw like a few comments here and there. No disrespect to them. But I'm probably going to do it again this episode, so let's go for it.
Yeah, you did. You won the most based vicar in the land contest. That's where I got that from. There's a series of challenges. And and you didn't just annoy atheists, Jamie. Let's be very fair. You annoyed Muslims as well. Let's be really fair.
Really?
Yeah, because you said that that Andrew Tate is following the wrong religion, and then there's a load of Muslims on the comments going, "Who's this vicar? Who does he think he is?
Oh no,
some kind of based vicar." Hopefully
you can respect people you can respect people who are disagreeing with them, can't you? This is the thing, Nick. You can't. Sorry to jump right into it, but religions are different. I have to put a flag in the ground there. You know, religions are different. They say different things. They've got different truth claims. They're not all compatible. So, it's ridiculous if I'm here as a Christian vicar saying, "Oh yeah, my religion's the same as everyone else's." It's obviously not, is it? Let's be real.
That is very real, and that's very based, and that's very on brand straight out of the gate. But what we were going to do today was go through Genesis. Through Genesis. My idea was we'll just go through the Bible in order. I'm up to page 8, guys. Only about 1,000 more to go. And Jamie's going to do them all. He doesn't know yet, but he's going to do hundreds of these, and we go through the entire Bible. But I'm thinking actually, more realistically, maybe we pick just some of the biggest bits. And Genesis is a pretty big bit, isn't it? It's pretty key.
It's pretty important. It's pretty important, yeah.
Yeah, and I just came up with this idea, and actually I realised, Jamie, classic me, I dreamt the whole thing 4 years ago, and we could talk about that at the end, but I've actually dreamt this whole series in ridiculous... Yeah, it's to a ridiculous degree. I've dreamt the Unlocking the Bible book, which we've been using. From David Pawson, I've already dreamt about using that book and talking to you. We can go into it at the end.
You dreamt this 4 years ago?
Yeah, I dreamt it 4 years ago. It's unbelievable.
Talking to me?
Huh?
About talking to me?
In the dreams... I'll go into it. Basically, the dream, and I can go into it more later, but basically, I had that dream we talked about on my podcast with you last time where I saw the cross in the sky.
Yeah.
And what I didn't mention then, I don't know if I mentioned it or not, I might mention it on your podcast, was that the cross was on the background of a really old book. And me being a complete idiot, I didn't realize until just now that that's the Bible. Until like a few days ago, because in the dream I was in a car going towards a giant cross in the sky with the big. And I'd say in the other podcast how I suddenly knew Jesus and God were real, and they were looking at me and all this kind of. I had this euphoric feeling and also fear. We talked about that, but what I didn't realize was that was the Bible, and also on the same night I had that dream about the safe. Do you remember me telling you about the safe?
Yeah. And you're trying to unlock it. Yeah,
I'm trying to unlock it, but I wrote that I wrote that there was a safe. And I'm trying to unlock it, and there was a square. I can't find it now because I wasn't planning to do this till the end. But here you go. I was trying to access a safe to put stuff in and get stuff out, but there was a big square hole in the safe door. I mean, not that dissimilar to that.
The size of the shape of the Unlocking the Bible book.
Exactly. And I was getting codes, and I was trying to open, and it's the Unlocking the Bible. And the other crazy thing was I was in the bookshop where I used to work, so that's the book connection.
Wow.
Which is unbelievable. And then. The bit about you is that as an earlier part of the dream, we were visiting some kind of church. I was asking an expert stuff about Jesus. I mean, that's you.
Wow.
And this is all in 2019, April 7th, 2019. And I had the dream about going towards the cross with the old book, about the unlocking the safe, and about talking to you. So I've literally dreamed this series.
Right.
Isn't that incredible?
That is incredible. I mean, I think particularly the thing about the book, I mean, the expert thing, that could be anyone, couldn't it? I mean, it could be anyone who knows about the Bible, but the book thing is pretty crazy because that Unlocking the Bible book literally have a picture of does it have a picture of a safe and a key on the front of it?
Yeah, it's not a safe, but it's a key and an old normal lock.
Yeah.
It's not, but it's very close, isn't it?
I told you to get that book before I realized, I mean, you may have told me about that dream before, but I would have recommended the book anyway, and I've only just made the connection. So that is pretty... That's pretty crazy.
And I just made the connection because you told me to get the book, I looked up the book on Audible, but it started suggesting these podcast type things, and then I realized there was lectures of it. So then I watched the lectures on YouTube, and I've only just got the book. But then only when I saw the cover of the book, I'm like, I was like, this is ridiculous. In fact, I didn't even get it then. I had to read my old dreams. I couldn't believe it. So some people, that may have alienated a lot of people already, but if so, it's probably a lot of the content for you. But
well, no, I mean, this is reality. You can't deny these kind of things happen when you open your eyes. These kind of things happen all the time. You know, the supernatural world is real, and people learn things through dreams all the time. And you know, lots of Muslims come to Christ through dreaming about Jesus and hearing him say, you know, come to me, follow me. Lots and lots of Muslims in our country and elsewhere. I know people personally like that. So dreams are real. They're ways that they're a way of God's communicating to us sometimes. I'm not saying that's all the time, but you know, I'm aware of many stories like this.
Sometimes they're just about your gas bill, but sometimes they're about unlocking the Bible in 4 years' time with the Reverend Jamie Franklin. And so for the viewer/listener, this is Unlocking the Bible by David Pawson. He did a whole series of lectures that are incredible, and they're on YouTube, and we will be using those. And we're just going to be going through Genesis in order, starting from the start, and using Pawson. Now, Pawson admits that Genesis is like a simplification. He uses his church building analogy. He says, look, if you were talking about building a church, you wouldn't talk about the critical path schedule. You would just, or schedule, you would just say, you know, we put it with the builders came, the joiners, then the plumbers, and it took 7 days, whatever. So he's saying that the language is simplified, but he is taking it very literally, especially versus someone like Peterson. If you watch the Peterson lectures on Genesis and things, and in his biblical introduction series, he's talking about the dreamlike substreets of religion. And to be fair to him, he does get into it in great depth, but it's a different kind of thing. It's taking evolution as a given, taking mainstream science as a given, and it's not a kind of straight, oh, the Bible's a myth, but it's a sort of, he's giving it great importance, Peterson, but he's not looking at it literally in the same way that Pawson is. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I haven't seen, I was just thinking about which Peterson ones I've seen. I've seen quite a few of them. I mean, I've seen the Cain and Abel one, for example, which I remember, and the Tower of Babel one. And I think what Peterson is doing, he's sort of analysing Genesis almost like it is a kind of dream, isn't it? Like it's a kind of archetypal dream of humanity that sort of has great wisdom and insight into the human condition, and sort of quite brilliantly, I can't really do his accent, but, you know, quite brilliantly combining that with insights from, you know, Jungian, what is it called? Psychology. So I agree with that. Pawson, you know, he's dead now. He only died reasonably recently, but he was a sort of, sort of evangelical, low church Bible teacher, but very, as far as it goes, I would say, sort of quite rigorous intellectually. For example, in his ones on Genesis, he's aware of the contemporary science. You know, we'll probably get into it around, you know, the fossil record or geological stuff and stuff like that. So, but yeah, very much taking the Bible as the inerrant word of God, as history, not as myth, and treating it seriously in that regard.
Yeah, and Pawson died in 2020, age 90. Incredible teacher, and if you get nothing else from this, just go to the Unlocking the Bible lectures. The thing we'll add to it is probably just banter, and a little, I don't know, it's just a way
we can respond. We can respond to it, can't we?
We can respond to it. And so Pawson's take on is very different. And by the way, you learn all sorts of little facts from Pawson, like it wasn't called Genesis, of course, until later. They just used to name it after the scrolls, and the scrolls were just called in the beginning. They were called whatever the first line of the scroll was. That was a kind of interesting detail. And he's full of those kind of things. But so one massive thing is how you deal with science and the Bible. And that's one thing that he addresses immediately, Pawson. And he says there are 3 different ways we can talk. And by the way, just for the listener, I'm going to have to do a bit more talking than I normally do on the podcast. Normally I just let the guest speak, but I have to do the structure, so don't shout at me. So there are 3 different ways that you can reconcile science with the Bible. He says you can repudiate, you can segregate, or you can integrate. And he says repudiation is bad because you can't just say science is wrong because it's got so much right, and you look silly. And he calls that committing intellectual suicide to believe that. And by the way, Jamie, within my structure, you can jump in whenever you want, by the way, because otherwise I'll just be reading. But you can just decide when you move to jump in. The second way is to segregate, to say there are different kinds of truths. There's a physical, material, natural truths versus the moral and supernatural truths. And I think ultimately Peterson's doing a very high level of that. He is separating it. He's doing it in a higher level way than most, but he is ultimately separating it, whereas Pawson's not. And he says another way of describing this is facts versus values. I've got a fly here. Remember you had that spiritual attack of the fly last time we did one? I've got one now. It's classic.
Klaus Schwab in your office.
Never have flies in here. So he says that fits our sort of Greek thinking, keeping the spiritual and the physical as two separate watertight compartments. But he says that kind of thinking is totally alien to the Hebrew mind, which saw God as creator and redeemer, so that the spiritual and physical belong together. Yeah. And he says this thing about treating it as a myth just won't work. And Douglas Wilson said a similar thing. There's a clip where Douglas Wilson watches Joe Rogan with David Mamet, and Mamet's just saying the Bible's a myth. But the problem with that is, once you start doing that, where do you stop? And both Pawson and Wilson have said that.
Yeah, this is not strict. This is slightly it's slightly maybe tangential. But the thing about the Greek thinking thing, I think, is very odd, because I think the Greek thinking, it depends what he's talking about, but in a kind of Platonic understanding, the spiritual and the material are bound up together with each other. So I don't really know what he means about that being Greek, but certainly I do understand what he means when he talks about segregating things out. And I think it probably is the way that most Christians deal with these questions around, science and the sort of contemporary scientific world seeming to say something so different to what Genesis says, in Genesis 1 in particular. I think that's probably the way most Christians deal with it. They never really sort of think about it too much. They just keep it in two compartments. So I think that's probably right. Sorry, I jumped in. I don't know whether you got.
No, that's a great jump in, because you know far more about, most things than me. I mean, I didn't know that was. Yeah, it's a good point. That's not a Greek way of thinking strictly. Yeah. He just said that for some reason. But the watertight compartments. Occasionally
Pawson says stuff which I think, oh gosh, I don't really know where he often comes out with just sort of random comments like that. But I don't really know what the point of saying something like that is. I don't think it's that simple. And I know you're going to go on to talk about integration, and I totally agree with what he says about integration. I just don't know whether that's indicative of what Greek philosophy was actually doing. But I would say that, Nick, because I'm a Christian humanist, and I believe that lots of Platonic philosophy is compatible with Christianity. So I would say something like that.
Very interesting. All right. Yeah, well, he's doing these speaking lectures, isn't he? And often you do say things. I certainly know from all my time in stand-up comedy, you say things on the stage like, what was I talking about there? And he points out, look, Adam and Eve would be called myths then Noah, then Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, then Moses, and then ultimately, and he says we have now theologians calling the resurrection a myth. And this was in the early 90s he was doing these, I think. So he's saying, or in the 90s, so where do you stop? Yeah. And he said you end up just putting the Bible alongside the Quran, the Holy Vedas, and that will destroy the Bible.
Yeah. So I mean, can I jump in again here? Yeah. Okay. So just to put my cards on the table here, I'm not really sort of firmly in any camp when it comes to talking about Genesis 1 and 2 and so on. And I'm not coming from the position of as somebody who's an expert specifically in the Hebrew or in the Old Testament. I'm just coming at it from my own perspective. I've got other areas where I think I am a lot stronger, where I do know quite a lot. But this is just coming from my own personal experience and what I know with the amount of education that I have. But so Genesis 1, just to speak speak to this question of where do you stop if you treat some of it as myth or poetry. There would be people, and I would say they were completely sort of orthodox Christians, some of them very safe in inverted commas, somebody like the apologist William Lane Craig, for example, to cite a contemporary evangelical academic.
He's great, by the way. He had those debates with Christopher Hitchens, and he basically spanked him. But sorry, carry on.
Yeah. Christopher Hitchens got into it. It was sort of mumbling away, wasn't it, into his chin, because he didn't know what to say. Sorry, atheists. So Genesis 1. Yeah. So basically, what Craig would say about this is this is clear. If you look at the genre, this is clearly kind of mythopoetic history. Which goes on until I think he would probably say chapter 2 verse 3, and then in chapter 2 verse 4 then you get into something which No, actually, he'd probably go for the whole first 3 chapters of Genesis, I would have thought. Yeah, so anyway, he'd probably say like the chapters 1 to 3, they're all sort of mythopoetic history, and then you get into chapter 4, and and there's a more of a historical feel. It's like it's a question of the genre of literature. I probably misrepresented the specifics of his viewpoint, but the actual general idea would be that you can differentiate between different genres of literature, between say a mythopoetic genre and something which is meant to be, a sort of more straightforward historical narrative. But to be honest,
he said it should be laid out as such. He said, "I hope you've got a Bible where you can see when it's poetry and when it's prose." So there is poetry, there's history, there's prose. Go on.
Pawson said that, did he?
Yeah.
Yeah. He did, and Pawson would agree that there's poetry in the first 3 chapters of Genesis. But I think Pawson's view would be that this is not mythopoetic. It's not a myth. It's telling you exactly, well, not exactly, it's probably the wrong word. It's telling you what happened. If you went back into history and looked at it, you would see what it describes in Genesis, in Genesis 1-3. Whereas William Craig would say that, would not say that. He would say it's a poetic account. It's a mythical and poetic account of what happened. So what actually happened in terms of what literally happened is not described in Genesis 1-3. It's written in a different genre. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Yeah. Well, yeah. Pawson. Yeah, it would be much more straightforward. He said. He said, when it's prose, that's God telling you what he thinks, and when it's poetry, that's God telling you how he feels. He was. I mean, that's not the same thing as Craig at all, is it?
No. That's a. I think Pawson's making a different. He's making a different kind of observation at a more sort of general level about the types of literature in the Old Testament. And again, that's it's a massive generalization, isn't it? There's all sorts of poetry, and lots of the poetic writings in the Old Testament are written. Sorry, lots of the prophetic literature in the Old Testament is written in poetic forms, and it's not even written. Some of it's not even written from God's perspective. So it's a huge generalization. But what Craig is talking about is from a kind of contemporary scholarly perspective, that there are different identifiable genres of writing which you can, for example, observe in other texts that were written around the same time, which aren't the Bible, and you can see that these are different genres. So the specific genre that he thinks that Genesis 1-3 is written in is called mythopoetry, or the mythopoetic genre. He just wrote a book about that. I forget what it's called. It's a book about the historical Adam. I haven't read it, but just to put that out there. And again, I'm not saying I to be honest with you, I land more on. I think that the Genesis 1-3 is literally true, and I don't land. I believe that it's literally true, and I'm not prepared to say that it's a mythopoetic account. But I don't want to miss the opportunity to represent that viewpoint, because it is a widely held viewpoint, that sort of thing, and there is an answer to it, that's out there, that's been given in a robust way.
Okay, very interesting. Yeah, William Lane Craig is excellent. I definitely recommend his debates. I haven't read his book.
Yeah, he's a good man and a completely orthodox Christian. I don't really share his view on this, but he's a good man for sure.
All right, and well, Pawson says God is the God of history. He says we're reading his story, and he points out that Jesus accepted Genesis as factual.
Yeah.
So he says that you can't segregate in that way, but that's the common way that Christians have tried to get around it.
Yeah.
And he says, instead, both scripture and science are in fact overlapping circles, and they are dealing with some things that are the same, and therefore there are apparent contradictions between them, which we must look at. So he says, therefore, the best way is to integrate and remember that the transitional investigations of science, i.e. that it changes its views. So, an atom was once the smallest thing, now it's not, and so on. Geology is changing, DNA has emerged. He says that the earliest form of life has the most complicated form of life, which is DNA in it already. And he claims that mathematically DNA is a language passed on from one generation to the other. Therefore, DNA must have a person behind it. I wasn't sure totally what that meant, but...
Well, he means that DNA is written in a language. It uses letters and identifiable forms of what we would in other circumstances consider to be communication. And you don't get things like language and intentional communication without some kind of mind behind it. So right. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me to be a pretty convincing thing to say, because I mean, I find the whole idea that something like DNA could have evolved I just don't believe it. I just don't believe it could possibly happen. It does seem to me to be the only explanation really can be that it was created by a designer, by somebody by something of great intellectual power beyond our understanding, and the idea it could have developed by chance over a period of billions of years. Well, it just seems to me rather fanciful. And here we go. I'm already getting into it, Nick. Even though I said I wasn't going to come down hard on any particular viewpoint. But and again, I'm not coming at this from a perspective of real knowledge or anything. I'm just telling you my sort of where I'm at with this. But DNA, as far as I know, there's no sort of there's only speculation in terms of how DNA could have actually evolved, isn't there? There's no sort of understanding of how DNA could have evolved in terms of transition or anything like that. We just have DNA, and it's just an article of faith upon the evolutionary paradigm that it must have evolved, because evolution must be the answer to absolutely everything. But it does seem to be a fantastic thing. To believe such a thing. It takes an awful lot of faith, I think, to believe such a thing.
Yeah, I know. Sorry to have a path of the atheist, but yeah, the idea that everything was chance, I think, is looking like more and more like one of the most insane viewpoints. I don't mind as much if they say it's intelligent design, but they don't go for Christianity. I can sort of, I go, okay, it's up to you. And if they go, it's a simulation, I can live with that logic. When people say it's just pure chance, I can't. It's just so stupid. I can't live with it. But we will get someone on about evolution, because we're quite anti-evolution on this podcast. And Alistair Williams, James, everyone's been saying you've got to represent the evolution position.
We shouldn't say it's pure chance either, because that's not quite what evolutionists believe. They believe in random genetic mutations which are passed on through survival of the fittest. So it's not really chance. It's
good point. I'm straw manning them.
Yeah, it's a process. I've read Dawkins. I remember reading Dawkins' book. What's it called? The Greatest Show on Earth, where he goes to great lengths, pontificating about this, because he finds it very annoying when people say it's chance. But I mean, what I would say is that all right, it might not be chance, but it's still a creative process, which, I mean, if it's real, it tends towards greater and greater fecundity and complexity and beauty, and variation, and so on and so forth. And that force which exists in the universe is itself mysterious. Why does this? Why, if this process is real, why does it happen? Why doesn't it tend towards decay and destruction and lack, as everything else seems to do when it's subject to the normal forces of entropy in the universe? There does seem to be a kind of a force in the universe, to whether one is a creationist or whether one is an evolutionist. There does seem to be a force in the universe which tends towards life and fecundity and variation. There seems to be something in the universe that wants life to exist. So even if you do believe in evolution, I'd still say that there must be this, at the very least, this force that exists in the universe. And that it's very hard to sort of account for it in terms of a bare materialistic. I mean, let's face it, Nick. The whole bare materialistic, naturalistic, atheistic thing is it's so preposterous. I'm sorry. I'm gonna offend all the atheists. It's just so preposterous, because even if you can have a complete understanding of the evolutionary process, which we by no means have in so many ways, there are still laws of nature which these things have to run along. So you still need to work out, even after you worked all that stuff out, there would still be these laws of nature. I mean, what are they? They just exist, well, they're just there. Well, that's not an explanation. Like you just, a materialistic view is just, it just doesn't do anything towards really explaining why things are the way they are. So there we go. That's the first anti-materialist rant.
Well, I think if atheists are still listening to this, they're probably prepared to be offended, because they were like, well, they're listening to a vicar talk about Genesis, and it's like they're probably up for it. Otherwise they'd have turned off.
I'm not just gonna roll over and say, oh yeah, we have to believe evolution because of the 19th century, and now we have to reevaluate everything. I'm not going to do that. I do agree with Pawson that we shouldn't be dismissive of science, and we should pay due respect to it in terms of what it's given us, and in terms of the great discoveries that it has made. Absolutely, but I think we need to integrate the provisional understanding of science that we have with the Bible, and it can't be in such a way as that it undermines what the Bible is clearly saying. I do understand what Paulson says when he talks about our interpretation of the Bible not being inspired or infallible. I agree with that, but nevertheless, there is a limit to which that goes, and I
Okay.
think the idea that well, anyway, I'll stop there.
You're getting ahead of me because I haven't even said that bit yet. So
Yeah,
let's,
sorry.
yeah. So yeah, he says he talks about the best ways to integrate, and remember that science changes. And he says he says the thing about DNA having a person behind it, that geology is changing. There's these different ways of finding the age of the Earth, and he talks about some people have said people arguing about the age of the Earth, whether it's 9,000 years, 175, or 4.25 billion, like others say. And he talks about anthropology's changed over the years. Creatures we thought to be our ancestors are no longer regarded as such. Biology has changed. He makes an interesting claim here. Very few believe in Darwinian evolution today. And I was thinking loads of people believe in it, don't they?
But does he mean, is it actually a more subtle point than that? Because there are different forms of evolutionary theory, aren't there? And I think the Darwinian paradigm has been superseded by there are two different stages beyond Darwin, isn't there? There's the one we're in now, I know, is called the extended evolutionary synthesis, and then there was a one beforehand. I can't remember what that one's called or what that one's about. But is that what he meant?
I think he definitely means that. He's following it and saying, look, even Darwinianism strictly is outmoded. But when I say I think people do, I mean ordinary people on the street just basically think that we've accepted Darwin. They haven't.
Right. Okay.
They're not. But it's two different points. But I just think. Yeah, okay, it may be outmoded in scientific circles, but actually we're sort of living as if we all believe in the basics of Darwinism in the Western world, I would say. Yeah, I mean, okay. That's what I think anyway.
Yeah.
But his point there is science changes, so we can't tie the Bible to any particular age of science or it would be thrown away in the next generation. And then he said the thing that you just alluded to, traditional interpretations of Scripture can also change. The Bible is inspired, but our interpretations may not be. So we have to be flexible. Hence, when scientists realize to be transitional and our interpretation of Scripture may change, then we can seek to integrate science in the Bible and make balanced judgments where contradictions seem to exist. So he's sort of saying, let's not tie ourselves to a generation of science or one particular interpretation. Let's just be open, but not just giving in to, this science is usurp the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, I go with that. Well, the only question is, how you sort of safeguard, how you tell the difference between an interpretation of the Bible that could be revised in the light of scientific discovery and interpretations of the Bible that you're not willing to revise in the light of science. So, Paulson clearly he's not willing to revise his view that the Bible teaches that human beings were specially created by God and didn't come from a common ancestor with other animals, right? I mean, am I right in saying that that's one of the places he goes in this?
I think so. That he says what again?
He doesn't believe in the common ancestry of human beings with other animals.
Right.
Okay,
I don't think science, so. I'm not certain, but I doubt it.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that's what he says. I've watched 2 or 3 of these lectures, and I'm sure he says that in the one about evolution. But so he wouldn't be willing to take something that would require that drastic a rereading of Genesis as he sees it, even if the majority of scientists do say it. So there is a. Although I agree with the principle, there is nevertheless a point at which you can't just say, well, my interpretation of the Bible is wrong here, and I've got to change it if the Bible is saying something which is very clear. So, Jesus believed in a historical Adam, for example. I agree with that. Jesus clearly believed in a historical Adam. So Adam must have existed in the way that the Bible says he existed. And if science comes along and says he can't have existed, then science is wrong, and when science finds the right answer, it will conclude that it is indeed a possibility. I'm just offering that as an example. Do you see the point I'm making?
Yeah, and Paulson says somewhere, by the way, if we go for the it's all a myth thing, then Adam becomes an everyman rather than a specific man, Adam. But sorry, you were not saying that. You So you basically you go along with Pawson on that.
Yeah, I think if Jesus says something, then it's true, isn't it? I mean, that's a problem if you're going to start saying that things that Jesus said weren't right.
Yeah, it says he said he accepted Genesis as true. So yeah, and he goes in. Do you want to go into this thing about the days? Because this is actually really interesting because he gives one example of how interpretation changes, and one example, and the example he gives is the days in Genesis, and there are 5 different ways of looking at the days in Genesis, and we're getting onto the actual Genesis in a minute, by the way, guys. This is just the overview. So and people don't even grasp these. Even a Christian the other day said to me, "Oh yeah, I go with this one," and then in turn incorporated part of a different one. I go, "No, that's a different one." So there are 5 different ways that he lays out, and he says that yom is the Hebrew word for a day, but it can mean 24 hours, like a day. It can also mean daylight hours, and it can also mean an era, like the day of the horse and cart is over. So that's the first thing. And so if it's 24 hours in Genesis, he says you need to find more time somewhere between verses 2 and 3, apparently. And some people find it in the flood. Some people say that the time without form and void was much longer, then God put it right in 6 days. And other people say that God creates antiques, by which he means things arrive and they already look old, like a tree that's already old. And there's also a strange thing about Adam, which I don't fully claim to understand, where it's like, how old did he look? If did he look 30 years old, but was he actually half an hour old because he'd just been created? So that's complicated.
Yeah. So what he's saying there is Adam must have been created with the appearance of age.
Yeah, but he's actually not. But I don't know if that's a separate point, because he's not going with this one. He's saying the 24-hour one is flawed, and I think he thinks the antiques one is flawed. But he's saying that it doesn't really work because you've got to find extra days. Then he goes on to a second one, which is the geological era, which some people go for, which is it's not 6 days but 6 geological ages. So it's the era, the day meaning the era, the horse and cart type of meaning. There's a third one, which is the mythological, which just treats the 6 days as pure myth, poetic framework. So the point is to get the moral. It's what he calls a fabled day. So in that one, it doesn't matter. It's just a story. In the fourth one, this is an interesting one. It's the educational theory, where God revealed his creation in stages to Moses. So it's a school day for Moses. So it's through Moses' view of it, and God's imparting wisdom to him in different stages, i.e. school days, which is interesting. And he says God would either reveal it verbally or as a kind of picture show in that theory. And then he has the one that he goes for, which is the best one, which is God days, where he says time is relative to God and to us. So 1,000 days are like a day to God, and a day like 1,000 years. So to God saying the whole creation is a week's work, but that's God days. It's a bit like dog years or something, or it's like to God a day is like could be thousands of years. That one makes sense, and he says that's the best one. And other ones like the era one tends to just reduce human importance to just a blip, and in history. And yeah, so he goes with that one. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing, Nick, is having been very strident about a number of things, I sort of look at this and I feel sort of fairly ambivalent about it. I can see why people insist on the 24-hour thing, because it does seem to be the straightforward meaning of the text. But then when you consider the way that day is used differently in English, it doesn't do violence to the language to say that sometimes the word day means a period of time, like the day of the horse and cart. So if that's the case in Hebrew as well, then I can't see why that wouldn't be the case. But I'm not entirely sure I'm convinced by it. I'm open to it. I'm open to Pawson's view, which is the God days thing. But I suppose what you would say to counter that is that Genesis 1 is sort of a week, isn't it? It's clearly 7 days, finishing on the Sabbath day. It's not. There's no indication given that these are epochs or eras in the text itself, and so that's what somebody who would want to stick to a 24-hour period reading of it would say. So I think it's either one of those, but they're pretty significantly different, aren't they? Whether it's 24 hours, I don't know about the middle three. The educational one seems a bit crazy to me, but it's either 24 hours or ages. Well, I'm not sure which one.
Yeah, they're quite different. Well, yeah, well, 24 hours, ages, and God days are three different theories in this. So yeah, no, that is tricky.
Oh yeah, so what's the ages one then? What do you mean, the geological ages? Yeah, I didn't mean that. I meant the God days thing. The other way I've heard that explained is that in the book of, I think it's 1 Peter, Peter says, 1,000. I think he says 1,000 years to us is like a day to God, or something like that. That's a paraphrase of what he says. So people have said, oh, you see, well, there's an example of the way that time is relative to God. And to us, so what seems to us to be a really long time is to God just a day. So maybe the Genesis 1 is speaking that way as well.
Yeah, I think it fits with Paulson's original point about, he makes at the start about, it's a way of explaining it that humans can understand. It's kind of, is that the same point? It is tricky, and it's, if God's saying it's 7 days, it's like, you'll get this when I say 7 days, but yeah, I don't know, but is it? But then, like you say, the Sabbath, is it literal day?
Yeah, it's confusing to us now, though, isn't it? If that was God's intention to make it simple.
That's true. Yeah, he could have made it simpler because we've got five different versions.
Now it's really confusing. But I tell you what I do like about this is, I think that the old Earth thing, old universe, old Earth, that's not as much of a problem theologically as the idea that human beings came from a common ancestor with other animals, and that there wasn't a historical Adam. By the way, earlier I realized when I said Jesus believed in a historical Adam, I think what I was actually thinking of is the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul definitely believed in a historical Adam, and he said, in the book of Romans, for example, that the historical Adam, death came into the world through sin, and as a result all sinned, which is what it says in Romans 5:12. And then he goes on to talk specifically about Adam over and over again. So the Apostle Paul definitely believed in a historical Adam, and the whole idea of original sin and the redemption that's wrought by Christ is dependent upon there being a historical Adam, as far as the Apostle Paul is concerned. I'm not actually certain what Jesus said about the historical Adam, so I just want to add a little bit.
Yeah.
I may have been too strident there. But yeah, certainly the Apostle Paul did believe in a historical Adam.
I believe Jesus made reference to Cain and Abel, and seeing that as proof that they were persecuting of good people throughout time.
Is that right?
I think so.
Okay, yeah.
But you're the vicar.
and then the other thing that definitely is in the Gospels are genealogies which go from Christ back to Adam, as though Adam is a real historical person. For example, at the beginning of the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke. So the writer of Luke seems to believe that Adam is a historical person. But anyway, the point I'm making is that I think that historical Adam is really, really important. Historical Adam and Eve, and the stories in Genesis about Adam and Eve and the fall, that's really, really important. The age of the earth and the age of the universe, I would say, is less so. And if you want to read Genesis 1 and say, well, Genesis 1 is talking about eras, as long as you don't sort of throw away the text and start, doing violence to it beyond saying, that the interpretation of the word yom, day, is flexible, I don't really see that that's a huge problem. I do see it's a huge problem saying there was no Adam, there was no Eve, there was no fall. Human beings are evolved in the same way as all the other animals are evolved, and that we're not sort of essentially different from them by virtue of our creation by God or something like that. I think that is a massive problem. In fact, I think that just destroys the entire Christian religion if you say that. So does that make sense? So Paulson's view, older. I think Paulson's view is basically old Earth, no macro evolution, and certainly that human beings weren't evolved from a common ancestor. I think that view is a totally orthodox, fine view personally, and it's probably the closest. I don't really have a firm view on it, but that would be my sort of inclination to say something like that. Yeah, maybe the universe is old, maybe the earth is old, but human beings must have been specially created by God. There must have been an Adam and Eve. There must have been a fall. And those things are not negotiable. And I'm skeptical about the notion of macroevolution, but I don't think that's necessarily the most, that's not the most crucial thing outside of those things that I just mentioned.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. But I reckon we've done probably enough on the very beginning of it. This theological discussion has it's hotting up, and I'm getting too hot in this.
No, no, Nick. Let me just wait before we move on. Why do
Yeah.
you? What do you think about this? Have you got like a view, old Earth or evolution or what? You know.
Yeah, well, I defer to the expert chain because I'm reading it I'm taking the Bible on its own terms, and I'm not trying to add interpretations at this stage, really. I listen to Peterson, I listen to Pawson, but I'm not trying to over-interpret. I'm just sort of trying to just read it as a layman, which I am, and I'm interested in all the theories, but I'm not making any conclusions. And I'm asking you because you know much more about it, and I tend to lean towards the God days theory with the 5 days, just because that's the one that made most sense to me. So I can, I lean to, and I think he's right that you have to, I think he makes a good case. I tend to go along with his case for integrating science. Certainly repudiating it won't work. And segregating it is interesting in the way that I believe Peterson's done an advanced version of that. And you listen to Peterson, it's always very interesting, but you do think, is he kind of, is that really in the Bible? And you also think, is he missing the point? Is it too psychological? Douglas Wilson always describes Peterson as close to the kingdom and things like that. So I think there's a flaw in that, doing it Peterson's way, but obviously Pawson's way can be quite easily critiqued these days. So, but anyway, I'm trying to just keep an open mind and be very, just read it. And with that in mind, I've got a series of very naive questions for you. But here's one that struck me immediately. Yeah. This is a massive one. Why did God put the tree of knowledge there in the first place? Now, the tree of knowledge, Pawson says, really means experience, because of course you get the phrase Adam knew Eve, meaning had sex with. So therefore, that's new. So therefore, tree of knowledge is really tree of experience. And my question is, was it so that we had free will? Because the tree's right there, but we have to deliberately not partake of it. Was that to do with free will? What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. So
I've smashed it.
Yeah, you got it right, Nick. You don't even need me to answer. So the tree of the knowledge of good and evil it symbolically represents, and it literally is. It's the point at which human beings have the opportunity to obey and love God and cleave to Him in the goodness of His commandments, or to turn away from them and to find out the hard way that disobeying Him, living without reference to Him, is not going to work. And the alternative to that would be a universe in which there was no. Our actions have no real consequences in terms of right and wrong. It would essentially be we would essentially be kind of automatons with no choice. So God wants us to choose Him freely, and He's wanted that since the beginning. And He can't force that. He can't force us to love Him. He gives us the choice. One line by C.S. Lewis, which I really love from the Screwtape Letters, is that He can only woo, He can't ravish. I really like that line. I think it's a really good line, and it sort of sums up in a very pithy way this point. God doesn't ravish. He doesn't force us to love Him. He woos us to Himself, but ultimately it will be up to us. And so I think that's what the tree represents, and that's why it's there in the first place.
Couldn't He woo us without the fairly harsh stick of the tree of knowledge just sat there deadly? You got the tree of life and the tree of life. I mean, did it have to be? Couldn't we have still had free will without in a less extreme way? I don't know.
Yeah, potentially. I think it's about the. I think the thing that's important about this is the subject matter. It's about whether or not we're going to accept and love God, and ultimately the consequences of that question are extremely significant. It's about who we are as creatures, our fundamental purpose in this world. And if we accept God and love Him and desire to know Him, then we can fulfill the purpose for which we're created. And if we don't, then we can't. So it's sort of, in that sense, the consequences are very, very serious. So we're talking about a sort of fundamental question, an existential question, if you like. So, yeah.
And I'm trying to think of the literal reason why the tree might be there, but it's almost impossible to have, because you're doing an interpretation there, but it's almost impossible not to, because if God's put the tree of knowledge, there, He's put it there. That begs the question immediately, why, and then you come up with these sort of answers. There is no It's almost impossible to have a purely literal reading of
Yeah.
that.
Well, yeah, and I think the text doesn't tell you why God put it there, right? So you have to sort of interpret it in a certain way. And although I do want to say that these things literally happened, and I don't want to dismiss them and dismiss the idea of a historical Adam, there is nevertheless a sense in which the story resonates existentially with every single human being who's ever lived. The notion of there being something in your life which you know is wrong and you know you shouldn't do, but nevertheless you feel drawn towards because it offers you some kind of experience which is going to make you complete and satisfy you, but at the same time it's a turning away from God or a turning away from the good, or however it is you understand it. So we have to hold on to both of these levels. The literal level, there was a real tree, there was a real decision on the part of Adam and Eve to sin, but nevertheless there's a sort of existential resonance that this story has with us. But I would argue that the existential resonance speaks to the truth of the story, not to a sort of pure, it's being true on a kind of purely symbolic or metaphorical level, if that makes sense.
Okay. And here's the problem. The problem is, the problem is not, is the problem experience itself versus innocence, or is it the nature of the experience that the serpent was convincing Eve that she could be her own God, essentially? That would seem to be the key thing.
Yeah, I think so. It's an interesting question, isn't it? I listened to Pawson talking about this, and he sort of compared it. He used an analogy, didn't I forget which, but something like, it's like a parent telling your child, don't put your hand on, on the hob or something like that. And there are two different ways that the child can respond to that. On the one hand, they can say, okay, I won't do that because that would be bad. And so that's a type of experience, but it's a kind of experience which is accepted on the basis of trust and faith in the wisdom of one's parent. So that's one type of experience. And then the other type of experience is to put your hand on the hob. The child puts the hand on the hob, burns himself, and then recognizes via that type of experience that this is wrong. And that's the kind of experience you don't want to have, you don't need to have, because you could have taken it on trust. Whereas, the child who burns himself decides, well, out of pride, that I want to do this myself. So I think that's quite a good analogy. It's quite a good way of thinking about it. It's not experience as such, because of course lots of experiences are good, but there are some kinds of experiences that we just don't need to have in order to recognize that certain things are bad.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Okay. And the bit I specifically meant as well was when the serpent says, "You will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil."
Yeah.
So the idea of being like God clearly is sort of the ultimate impudence, but why would knowing good and evil? I don't know. Why is that such a problem? I suppose it's obviously not the end of innocence, obviously, but
Yeah. Well, there's a question of what Satan meant there, right? So Satan isn't telling the truth. Like, Satan's lying. So what does he mean when he says you will know good and evil? Maybe he means that you'll have the kind of knowledge that God has about the nature of good and evil. So God doesn't experience evil because God doesn't do evil, but he must have some kind of insight into evil. So maybe Satan was kind of promising something like that kind of insight to Eve, and so she decided that she'd like to have that kind of insight. And Satan's saying to Eve that God is lying about the consequences of eating the fruit, isn't he? So you won't die. Conversely, what will actually happen is you'll become like God, knowing good and evil. So you have the same kind of knowledge that God has, and therefore you should eat the fruit. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does make sense.
I might look that up actually. I've got a number of books here. As I said, Nick, I'm not an expert in this area at all.
No, as I am.
So, you are. It's your area. I'm going to look up.
You can look up, and I might carry on because I can wait for you to look that up if you want, or I can carry on. Well, I'll just say for the listeners.
What verse is that specifically? It's 4 and 5, isn't it? 3, 4, and 5. Mm-hmm. Chapter 3, 4, and 5.
Yeah.
In my book here. Sorry, you carry on.
Yeah, I'll carry on. One thing that's really interesting is the sort of way when God discovers this, he curses them. Of course, Adam tries to deny it, and he blames Eve, which is lame, and he tries to hide, and they use the pathetic fig leaves. And the punishment is that he punishes the snake to slither along on its belly. And that's interesting because this serpent probably had legs. And Pawson points out that snakes, it's actually boas and pythons, I checked, still have tiny legs.
Yeah, they've got little feet, yeah.
They've got tiny legs, but in Genesis, God, cursed them to slither on their belly, so perhaps it had legs until that point, which snakes did used to have. Little interesting fact, there are certain snakes. And he curses the snake, but he also curses Eve, of course, and says that childbearing will be painful. And that this part really interested me, JB, and I've got a controversial red pill point. He says, your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. And this is a great punishment. So I was going to ask you, is marriage therefore a punishment? If you make it so that a woman has a desire contrary to her husband, but must obey her husband, at least at that time, was marriage intended as a kind of punishment, or at least the post-fall version of marriage?
Yeah, so marriage definitely not, because marriage is a prelapsarian ordinance of God. Prelapsarian, by the way, is lapsarian's to do with the fall, right? You familiar with this word? Yeah. So prelapsarian is before the fall, post-lapsarian is afterwards. So if something's prelapsarian, it's a good, it's a sort of unalloyed good. At that point, it's part of God's intention for creation. So marriage is something that was instituted by God before the fall.
Yeah.
So it can't be a bad thing. But
then modern marriage became cursed with this phrase.
Yeah. So there's as a result of sin, there is a tension in marriage whereby the sexes are inclined to engage in sinful types of behavior, which cause tension and difficulties and breakdowns in the relationship. So where is it specifically? Your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. So, all right, Nick, so I've got to put my cards on the table here and say something politically incorrect, but which is nevertheless true. Eve eats of the fruit first, and then Adam, and Adam's blamed for it. In Romans chapter 5, the Apostle Paul says that death and sin came into the world through one man, and he says over and over again that it was through Adam. Now, you look at the story, and you can quite clearly see that Adam is blamed for it, and Eve is not blamed for it ever, even though she did it first. And the reason for that is because Adam was the head of the marriage as the man, and therefore he had to take responsibility for the wrongdoing of his wife. And that speaks to the view, which is just taken for granted throughout all of Scripture, that, as the Apostle Paul says, the husband is the head of the wife, meaning that the husband has responsibility for his wife and his family in a general sense. Now, in Ephesians 5, I may have even said this, I've said this a lot of times on podcasts, but in Ephesians 5 talks about, husbands, love your wives, give yourselves up for them as Christ gave himself up for the church. Wives, submit to your husbands. There's an ambivalence, well, not ambivalence. There's a complementarity within marriage, especially in the light of the gospel, whereby we're called to love and serve one another and not to treat each other harshly, not to rule over each other in the way that's described here, which I'll come to in a minute, and so on and so forth. But there's nevertheless an order in marriage which God has given to us, whereby the husband is head, responsible, and has to be a leader, guider, provider, and everything like that. So that's where I'm at in terms of what the Bible says and in terms of what reality is. So given that, your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. I think that is talking about the way that dynamic, that benign and good dynamic, is corrupted by the fall. So your desire shall be contrary to your husband. I think that's talking about the way that the way that women and wives within marriage will be tempted to usurp their husband's authority in the marriage relationship and not be content with being underneath their husbands, in terms of the husbands being the head of the family, being the guider, the ruler, protector, wisdom, and so on and so forth. So the wife will want to rule over the husband, the wife will want to wear the trousers. He shall rule over you, I think, is speaking about the way that husbands, after the fall and as a result of sin, will use their strength and their power in order to subjugate their wives in a way which is diminishing or abusive or belittling. That could be through physical violence, but it could also be through the violence of words, harshness of manner, force of personality, and so on and so forth. So it's talking about the way that benign and good structure that God has built into marriage and the family is going to be corrupted by sinful impulses.
Yeah. Okay. And just on the first point of responsibility, just to reiterate, he says, God's asking, where are you and what are you up to and why are you cowering? And he says, why? Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree of which I commanded you not to eat? The man said, the woman whom you gave me to be with. That's quite funny. He says, this woman you gave me, she's a nightmare. The woman you gave me to be with, she gave me the fruit of the tree and I ate. So of course he blames her, and that's his big problem, is that you still ate it. Yeah, you didn't know it was from the tree. But you didn't check either, and you ultimately have responsibility. So
and is that not what we see in our world today, Nick? So many men who are just completely unwilling to take responsibility for their own actions, whether it's in marriage or anywhere else. Everyone deep down, I think, realizes that part of what it is to be a man is to take responsibility, not just for yourself, but for other people as well, and particularly in family, your family context. You can't just blame your wife and just sort of say, well, it's got nothing to do with me. You're responsible as the man. It just doesn't apply the other way around. It applies that way around. And so Adam is here, he's just he's representing what so many men subsequently have been and what so many men are today. People who are just completely unwilling to take responsibility, to take ownership for their own actions and for their own families.
Yeah, and what men would say now, or some men anyway, in counter to that, is that the authority God talks about has also been completely stripped from men. They have no authority and no respect in the culture. So then they say, well, then why should I take the responsibility? So that's where we are. But it seems like maybe that's where we always were. If you look at Adam and Eve there, and this is an English Standard Version, by the way. I do have the King James as well, which in some ways is more poetic. My shot is too dark for you to see it. But I went with the English Standard because partly on your recommendation, because it is obviously clearer.
It's good, it's good.
But so that's that part. And it's also very interesting. He punishes the serpent because of course Adam blames Eve blames the serpent. So everyone's blaming everyone. He punishes the serpent to crawl in its belly. He punishes Eve to be in pain in childbirth and have this problem in marriage of contrary desires. And of course he punishes Adam by really his work he's going to have to work, and it's going to be toil and sweat. And he says, thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, meaning the earth, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread. So that's he makes his work. He makes him have to work, and he makes work difficult. That's my interpretation. You can correct me if you want. And then crucially he says, till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So death, which wasn't there before. So that's a pretty big one. So pretty tough on the man. I mean, woman gets pain in childbirth and marriage problems, but the man gets work and death. Yeah, so pretty harsh.
Well, the woman gets death as well. So I think work is also a prelapsarian ordinance because God puts the man and the woman in the garden, and they're to name all the animals and tend the garden. So there's a type of work before the fall. So work in itself is not bad. It's just that work has become toil post fall in the post-lapsarian situation. So the ground is now cursed. We can cultivate the land and work the land, but it's much harder and more difficult than it ought to be.
Right.
And
much harder than just naming stuff, which is kind of creative work.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So work and productivity and creativity, or whatever you want to say, that's all good stuff. It's just that it's laboured now, it's hard now, it takes it out of you. You feel tired when you do it, and you frequently get brain fog or whatever it might be, or get aching body, or all of the kind of negative implications of having to actually toil are a result of the fall. And in lots of ways, this is kind of hidden from us now, because we do still toil, but we toil in different ways, broadly speaking, in modernity. But if you consider what the history of mankind has been like before the invention of industrial machinery, agricultural machinery, dragging plows over hard ground and in the baking sun, or if you consider what childbirth was like before the advent of modern technology, it would have been completely different to the way it is today. So these things are still, there is still toil, and childbirth is still horrendous. But to a certain extent, we've been able to sort of mitigate the effects of these things and hide them from ourselves. So there is that. And then there's the thing about death as well. So Paulson says that he thinks that the tree of life would have sustained Adam and Eve, that they weren't made immortal, which is interesting. I'm not really sure what I think about that. I find that to be somewhat questionable interpretation, because it seems to me that what happens at the point of the fall is that death enters into the world. And death is not just the consequence of not eating from the tree of life. Death is like a power. The way the Apostle Paul describes it in Romans 5 is like that death is almost like a kind of demonic entity that enters into the world, and it's a completely unnatural thing. It's a kind of intruder into God's good creation. So I don't know really what to make of Paulson's interpretation, because his interpretation seems to be that death would be the natural consequence of not eating from the tree of life. But the way I've always understood it is that death is a completely foreign invader into God's good creation, which is placed upon human beings and the world in general as a curse as a result of sin. So yeah, there's that to consider as well.
I must be missing the distinction there, but the choice to eat from the tree of knowledge rather than the tree of life is what brings about death, right? So so yeah. What's the difference between you and Paulson there? I can't quite tell.
Well, Paulson's view is that Adam and Eve in their pre-lapsarian state were created mortal, and that they had to eat from the tree of life in order to continue to live. And what I'm saying is that seems to imply that death would have existed even if there hadn't been a fall, if they had just failed to eat from the tree of life. But my view would be that they were created immortal, and that it was as a result of the fall that they died physically.
Yeah, so it's a question of whether they had to keep eating from the tree of life to sustain themselves or not. Yeah, okay.
But there's an important theological point there, because death, in order for the story to make sense, it's not just about sin coming into the world, it's also about death. These are the twin enemies of creation. Sin and death, they come in, they're completely foreign, they've got no place in the pre-lapsarian world whatsoever, and then they come in as a result of the fall, and that's what Jesus deals with. So you can't have those things and that's part of the reason I think that lots of people rightly have questions about the evolutionary thing, because it does seem to be the case that you've got death kind of baked into the whole thing for billions and billions of years, or millions and millions of years, and if you're going to hold to the orthodox biblical view of what happened at the fall, you can't have death before the fall. It just doesn't work. It messes everything up theologically.
Okay, very interesting. And since we've done some heavy questions, what about a trivial question that I thought was a great question, and then Paulson specifically mentioned it as a kind of trivial question people ask, and I suddenly felt like a fool. But I wanted to ask you why does the devil not appear as a snake anymore? And I had a theory on this, that unless I've missed it, and he does, by the way, and my theory was that atheism's already won so much in this culture that if the devil was to show up as something like a serpent or a snake now, everyone would start believing in God, because they go, oh, the devil's real, so God's probably real, whereas he's completely won anyway because everyone's believing in materialism and atheism.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in it's not so much a snake. I mean, it'd be interesting. Like, I'm actually teaching myself Hebrew at the moment because I don't know it and I would like to know it. So I'm not a Hebrew scholar by any stretch of the imagination. In the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, the devil is referred to as a serpent, and I'd be interested to know if in the book of Revelation there's an equivalence linguistically with the snake in Genesis 1. It certainly seems the imagery is not far away. Serpent, snake, that could be the same thing. But I mean, broadly speaking, I agree with your viewpoint. I think that Satan's tactic in our culture is to remain largely hidden, and to allow people to just go on with their materialistic lives, believing that the spiritual world is a fantasy, and that's his. I was just reading something actually while I was waiting for you, which talks about the way that that secularism is a kind of suffocation of Christianity, and I think that's a really good way of putting it. Like secularism is all about kind of, from a spiritual perspective, it's all about just suffocating any sense of the spiritual world. So it would make sense that Satan is, withdraws and doesn't manifest himself overtly too much, but nevertheless, he does manifest himself through, occasionally in our culture, but it's not as much. If you were to go to cultures where that's not the case, you would frequently find people who are possessed by demons and things like that, and they would, it would be very obvious that Satan and demons are real, but I think he's hidden in our culture.
Yeah, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he doesn't exist. Kevin Spacey
Exactly.
in The Usual Suspects, and now Spacey's back, proved innocent, so you all have to watch his films again if you believe in law.
Yeah, it's actually a quotation from a French poet, Baudelaire, I think. The devil, the thing about the devil.
Well, I didn't think Spacey had come up with it. I assumed it was from something, but I didn't know Baudelaire said it. That's really interesting. All I know is Flowers of Evil.
Well, that's what he's famous. No, that's what he's famous for. That's like his Enter Sandman, isn't it? To do it.
You love your metal.
That's his Black Album.
I wonder where that came from in Baudelaire. So someone can tell us. But yeah, interesting.
It probably is from the Flowers of Evil.
He was a smart guy. Yeah, it might be, because I just know the title and I haven't read it for many, many years, and I don't remember seeing the quote. So, all right, slight digression. But and then there's a strange bit that I didn't totally get. Actually, maybe we'll do first another trivial question, because another trivial question Paulson mentions is about people having problems with the ages. So Adam lived till 930 years. Noah lived a very long time. He was 600 years old when the flood came. But so there's this thing of like, why are they all living so long? But then there's also this question. I was trying to figure out if man was condemned to live a less long time as a punishment for being attracted to women. I may have got that wrong, because it may be angels that he's talking about. But so there's this part which is labeled in this version, increasing corruption on earth. And when man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Great system. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. And then he starts talking about the Nephilim, who are kind of this is, I think, a mixture of angel and person. So it could be that he's talking about that, but I wondered from that passage if he's saying something about, well, look, you're attracted to women, fine, but you're not going to live as long. I don't know. It's a tricky one, because before then you've got people living 900 years and stuff. And was it Methuselah was 969? Adam was 930. Yeah.
So people have very strong views about the Nephilim. Let me just read this here, okay? So some people have thought that the sons of God were fallen angels, but the sons of God were probably not angels, because angels do not marry or reproduce, and it quotes something Jesus said about that. Some scholars believe this phrase refers to the descendants of Seth, who intermarried with Cain's evil descendants, the daughters of men. This would have weakened the good influence of the faithful and increased moral depravity in the world, resulting in an explosion of evil. Nephilim refers to a powerful race of giants. Right, next note, this is on verse 3. His days will be 120 years, means that God was allowing the people of Noah's day 120 years to change their sinful ways. God was showing great patience with humanity. So that's talking about, it's saying it will be 120 years till the flood, I think. Okay. All right, and then one more thing. The Nephilim were giants, people probably 9 or 10 feet tall. These may have been the same people mentioned in Numbers 13:33. Don't know what that is. Goliath, who was 9 feet tall, appears in 1 Samuel 17. The Nephilim used their physical advantage to oppress the people around them. So there's a little note on the Nephilim there. Doesn't really say much, apart from they were really big.
Oh yeah, I got that. Yeah, so I got that completely wrong. Was it when Methuselah died that he was going to do the flood? Because
I think so.
He waited, and he waited till then. So he's very patient. He waited 120 years. Like, I'm going to flood you, but I am going to wait. But he's obviously he doesn't mess around and doesn't go back on his words. Like, I'll wait 120 years and then.
I think the name Methuselah means that when he dies, it will happen, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. As in like
which is
flood
a heck of a thing to be called. Yeah, when he dies, it'll happen. So why do you think they live so long? People like Adam living till 930 years, and Noah. I can't remember what Noah was, but he was 600 at the start of the flood. And he lived a long time after that.
They were old, weren't they? Yeah, again, there are different theories on that. Some people think it's like a labeling, it's like a labeling thing, or it's a way of kind of talking about. It's a kind of common ancient Near Eastern way of talking about the greatness of someone by exaggerating how long they lived and so on and so forth. I've got no problem just taking it at face value and saying that they lived for this long. And it could be the case that for some reason human beings took a longer time. Sorry, the age of human beings reduced as we get further and further away from the fall, maybe as a result of sin and corruption, maybe something to do with genetics, the gene pool becoming more corrupted or something like that, or increasing other things which are harmful to human beings increasing on the earth, like bacteria or diseases or viruses. I don't really know, but I think it could be something like that. It's indicative of a kind of gradual degradation and decline, and so people live less and less long periods of time. Yeah.
Although Aubrey de Grey claims he's now fixing it, and that the first person to live to 1,000 has already been born. It wouldn't be the first person in biblical terms. Well, maybe, because they didn't quite reach 1,000.
Yeah, they didn't reach 1,000. So it does seem to be set now at somewhere around 100, 120 years old, doesn't it? It doesn't really seem like it's possible to get beyond that. I'd be surprised if these people are able to do this, but
yeah, they think they can cure death by curing. They say it's just damage accumulating in the body, and if they can cure it, it will. And then there's a terminal escape velocity, which we're improving our technology and lives are expanding faster than the rate of. Anyway,
yeah,
too much to get into. Well, because we're doing the Bible, I wanted to ask you about this bit on page 4 on mine. I'm not very good at knowing I suppose the chapter before as well. It's to Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. At that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Now, when it says Lord in the English Standard Version, that's instead of saying Yahweh, which is the Hebrew word, which people, I seem to have lost my note on that, which comes from, I think I've got it somewhere else. It comes from to be anyway. It comes from. There's different ways of looking at it. I completely lost my note, which is quite difficult because you can't just riff this one. It's and let's see if I can find it, because there's different ways of looking at it, but it's something to do with to be, isn't it? And it comes from another word, hayah, which is the Hebrew word. Here we go. I've not printed this out.
Yeah.
So Yahweh. Lots of people think it's. Many scholars believe that the most proper meaning may be He brings into existence whatever exists, and then there's Hayah, which is to exist, to come to pass, to happen, and then of course in Exodus there's God saying I am that I am, and so a couple of questions, and then we have Paulson's version of that, which is always. He goes with the phrase always because he said that's the closest. Oh, I have got it here. He says that's the closest he found in English. He said he prayed on a similar word to Yahweh, and he came up with always, which is a similar word in English, he claims, and also it's quite good because we talk about the Big Bang Theory, and the big problem they can't get around is what was there before for something to be created, and if God was so God must have been always there. So he says always is a great term for God in that way as well. But my question here is, what do you think of his substitution of always, and what do you think of? And why is it in this point in Genesis where people began to call upon the name of the Lord, which would be Yahweh in the original? Why does that happen there after Seth's birth?
Yeah. Okay. So just one point of nuance here. So it's when in the ESV, and I think probably in other modern translations, it's when the word Lord is written in capital letters.
That's what I'm saying.
Because if it's not written in capital letters, it could be it's probably a translation of Adonai, I think, or Adonai. So that's the YHWH word, Yahweh, and we add the vowels into it because there aren't any vowels in the Hebrew.
And that's also where Jehovah comes from, because they didn't understand that it was meant to be pronounced as a W. They thought the JV thing meant they thought Jehovah's a good version, but Yahweh is not like Jehovah. That's what Pawson says anyway. That's
what Pawson says, in his quite dismissive way.
Yeah.
He's like, but they were wrong.
Sorry, Jehovah's Witnesses, get out. Yeah,
Do you think
yeah,
he sounds a bit
yeah,
like James Mason? You know James Mason, the
yeah,
actor from
yeah.
Illusion. I think he really
But
reminds
with
me
a
of James
touch of sort of
Mason.
northern because he's from the northeast. So a
Yeah,
touch
but
of north.
I think he's from the northwest, isn't he? And I
No,
think
no, no. You're
wasn't.
right. Mason was from Yorkshire, wasn't he?
Yeah,
Paulson's
yeah,
from
yeah.
no. Paulson was as a Geordie originally, I think.
Oh, is that right? So they were from the northeast. Yeah, maybe I wasn't too far away from there. Okay, so sorry, just getting off the track there. So Lord means Yahweh. So what do I think about Paulson's calling him always? I think it's fairly idiosyncratic. My understanding of it is that it's a verb. It's like a sort of an allusion to the verb to be. So you could translate it, I am who I am, or I am what I will be, or simply I am. And Jesus is always using this formulation ego eimi in the Gospels, particularly in the Gospel of John, which is taken to be a reference to Yahweh. Ego eimi means I am. So in the Greek, eimi itself means I am, but the fact that he puts the word ego before, which means I, sort of it turns it into this kind of idiosyncratic construction where it means I am, but in a kind of emphatic way, which appears to be referring back to the divine name in the Old Testament, Yahweh. Thomas, it's got a history in theology as well. Thomas Aquinas makes a huge deal out of it. And he referred to God as he who is. And there's a great book by the 20th century systematic Anglican theologian E.L. Mascal called He Who Is, which is referring to that as well. But the point being, you're exactly right, Nick, is that God in himself has existence not as something which is given to him from something externally, but as something which is part of who he is within himself. Existence isn't it's not something which is accidental to God. It's something which is part of his essence, and so it's uniquely the case for God that existence is part of his essence. So that's why he can call himself to be, or I am, or something like that, whereas existence is just something that's kind of loaned to us by God. And you're exactly right. This is the one question that the atheist can never answer, because the universe does not have existence as its own essence. It's clearly contingent. It's clearly dependent upon something else for its existence, and that thing is God. That makes sense from a kind of metaphysical perspective. It doesn't. The materialist view that it doesn't make any sense, because the universe needs to get existence from somewhere. So that's a bit about that. Now the other question was about the actual text here. To Seth also was born, a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. At that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. That's a really interesting question. I've never actually thought about that before. I was just looking to see if I had any notes in my Bible, and I actually don't. So
Welcome to Stumping the Vicar with Nick Dixon.
that's an interesting one. So let's just read this here. I'm going to say this is the bit on this section. Unfortunately, when left to themselves, people tend to get worse instead of better. This short summary of Lamech's family shows us the variety of talent and ability God gives humans. It also presents the continuous development of sin as time passes. Another killing occurred. This is the verses just before as well. Another killing occurred, presumably in self-defense. Violence is on the rise. Two distinct groups are appearing. One, those who show indifference to sin and evil, and two, those who call on the name of the Lord, who are the descendants of Seth, apparently. Well, that's what it says in it, verse 26. Seth would take Abel's place as leader of a line of God's faithful people. So what he's saying there is that two distinct groups of people, those who are becoming gradually more worldly, separated from the ways of God, violent, sinful, and then there's another group of people who will represent the line of God's faithful people going forward.
Which is Seth, whereas Cain's line is the bad line.
Yeah.
Cain's line also includes the invention of metallurgy and music, weirdly. So I started to get worried because I love music. I'm like, music comes from Cain's line. I'm like, oh no, what's that about?
Yeah, I don't think it can be all music, can it? Because I don't like that either.
Or it could be that they did some good stuff as well. I don't know. I'm worried about that. But so why do you think they only started to call upon Yahweh then at that point?
Yeah.
Or they just did historically?
Well, I don't know what that means. I mean, I'm sure there'll be an interesting anthropological answer to that, but it might just be something as I was just looking back through the previous chapters, I mean, I was just wondering if it was to do with the divine name, if it was that previously they didn't use the divine name, but they used Adonai or something like that,
Right.
and they specifically started to use Yahweh there. I mean, that's just a guess. I don't know, but it's got to be something like that, hasn't it? Because people were calling on the name of the Lord prior to that. Because
Yeah, it could
you've still
be.
got Abel who's faithful.
It could be something not that
And
important that I've boringly chanced upon, and we shouldn't go into it too much. Maybe.
or maybe it's to do with people, like generally at that time, people generally started calling on the name of the Lord rather than, a few, rather than just Abel or, and a couple of others. It might be
Okay.
something like that.
Yeah. Well, someone can answer. I'm sure someone can write in and answer that maybe. But yeah, you're right. And before that, there was another killing from Lamech, who said if Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. I was wondering that. Why is his 77? I suppose just things getting even more extreme and worse. But
Yeah.
but all right. Well, so I've got to go reasonably soon. I think maybe we should leave it because there's too much. There's Cain and Abel. I don't know how much time we got. We've got a short amount of time. Or do you want to do Cain and Abel, Noah, and the Tower of Babel very quickly? It depends because
No,
like this is all in a first 8 pages, and it's unbelievable. The
Yeah.
creation of everything: Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah, Babel. First 8 pages, all of those.
Yeah. Do you think I just let's just pause and just think, have we sort of covered everything that we've spoken about so far really, really well? Is there any are there any clangers that we haven't spoken about which are important?
There's almost bound to be clangers with podcasting, and people are very keen to point them out.
Yeah, I think what we can say with absolute certainty is that this podcast will irritate lots of people because there are lots of people on the kind of creationist side of things who really, whenever I talk about anything to do with creation or evolution, they're really upset with me because I don't go in harder, as in like 6 days, young earth, it must be this way, blah, blah, blah. And I hope that I've satisfied them to a certain extent because I have tried to be clear about what I think is really essential. But nevertheless, it's just not an area where I've gone into like, loads and loads of detail and myself personally. So I'm not hugely confident on it. And then on the other side, there'll be people who are evolutionists, both people who are Christians, and there'll be atheists as well. And they'll think that, what I'm talking about is, like Pawson says, like the equivalent of intellectual suicide. And you're just like throwing away everything that's absolutely certain and talking nonsense and believing in myths from the Stone Age. So, and also I made all those comments about marriage as well. So there's bound to be people who are upset with this, and all I can say is that I'm just doing my best here. So
Yeah, it's funny that you're so in that world that you're sort of course, I mean, I'm in the world of people being upset on YouTube and in the comments things, but you're in the world of people being theologically upset, whereas I'm so naive. I'm just naively going through the Bible, not even aware of all the terrible conflicts that are to come. But I'm just doing it because maybe people will go back to the Bible, maybe they'll go to Paulson's lectures, maybe they'll find it interesting, and that's the only reason. And because I dreamt about it 4 years ago, that's the only reason. So I'm not claiming to have any answers, and you're a vicar, but you're not claiming to have all the answers in the Old Testament either.
It's good for me as well, Nick, because it makes me think about these things. And I watched these. I listened to the lectures while I was washing up this week, so it was it was an edifying way to sort of engage my brain while I was doing something manual. So it'd be good. I to be honest, I haven't watched the ones on Cain and Abel or Noah or Tower of Babel, so it'd probably be good not to go onto those before.
Okay.
Before I have done.
I've got so many questions about them as well when we get onto them. Like, why did Noah get drunk immediately after the flood? That's the kind of level of my insight. But it is an interesting question because you think at first he gets drunk immediately after the flood, and you think, okay, that's what people are like, and then he's naked. Then his sons have to cover him, and then he wakes up annoyed and curses Canaan. And then you think, why has he done that? He didn't do anything, and that's his grandson. And you think it's kind of like a sitcom ending to the bleak story of the flood. But then I realized it's because the Canaanites were troublesome neighbors at the time, so he was cursed. It had a propaganda aspect to it. So it's like, it's crazy. There's so much you can get into. Yeah. We're only 8 pages in. We're not even 8 pages in. We didn't even reach Noah.
Yeah. If we're not going to go into it any further, can I just make a further comment about this thing about Satan? Is that right? It's kind of slightly tangential, which is why I didn't say it earlier. But I've been reading this book called Demonic Foes, which is written by, hang on a second, what was his name? I'm going to look it up because I've forgotten it. But he's basically a very, very highly credentialed, Richard Gallagher, MD. He's a very, very highly credentialed psychiatrist who started because not because he was sort of looking for it or anything. It just came to him. He started investigating possessions and diabolical attacks and things like that. And honestly, it's the most sort of convincing. You remember what I said earlier about the devil hiding himself? This book is like the most convincing thing, I think, from a kind of straightforward, kind of rational perspective as to the reality of Satan and demons and their operations in this world. It's just absolutely remarkable. So just to elaborate on what I said earlier, I do think that Satan hides himself very, very well in our culture, but there are clearly people who either because they seek it out or because something happens to them, come into the contact with Satan and demons, often through the occult or Satanistic religion, who become either oppressed or possessed by evil spirits. So that kind of thing does happen, but I think it's quite rare. But this book, if anyone's interested to learn more about that, I really would recommend it. Demonic Foes by Richard
Very
Gallagher.
interested, but a little bit scared to read it. What if
it is
demonic
a bit
foes
scary,
start popping up?
But it does show you, Nick, like the reality of the spiritual warfare that we're living with. I mean, one of the things I find quite heartening. I mean, I'm an Anglo-Catholic, which just for relevant here to say is that I'm a high church Christian, so I believe in the power of the sacraments. I believe that there's something spiritually powerful about the Mass and about baptism and so on and so forth, and that they have apotropaic aspects to them, which means that they are like exorcisms. They repel demons. They have a spiritual force to them. There's a light that's going on when you're engaging in these things. And this book absolutely confirms that, because the demons hate the Mass, they hate the Eucharist, and they hate consecrated hosts. That's the thing they cannot stand more than anything else. And that's, in my view, that's because consecrated hosts are the holiest thing on the planet. And so they're spiritually powerful things. So I find that really, really fascinating. But it shows you the importance of taking this kind of thing seriously. The devil's real, demons are real, and it's a spiritual battle. It's just largely hidden from our eyes. Okay.
And as you were saying that, I think someone tried to get into my flat, which is also a spiritual attack. But I think it might just be my cleaner, because which is a very first world problem. But I'll deal with that. Thanks so much for doing this, Jamie. This and check out Demonic Foes. This has definitely the feel of sort of paid content, but we don't have a paid content set up yet. So I don't know. We might release this as a trial one and just to everyone, and then maybe do paid stuff in future. If you want to support the podcast and all the stuff I'm doing, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/Nick Dixon, and please subscribe on YouTube and subscribe on the audio and leave us a 5-star review. If you are listening to this wherever it comes out, it'll be on the current thing somewhere. And Jamie, where can people find you?
Yeah, so my podcast is called Irreverend Faith and Current Affairs, not irreverent, irreverend. It's a pun. And you can find it at, I just dinked my glass by, didn't mean to do that. You can find our website, irreverendpod.com. Everything is on there. And also you can follow my Substack, which is jamiefranklin.substack.com. So those two addresses will get you everywhere.
Okay, and I should have said that you're the host of Irreverent at the start. But this has a very paid content, loose feel. This is for the absolute hardcore. This is, things happen on this podcast. Demonic attacks, the glasses, doors opening, all sorts of stuff, and people forgetting key facts. But we're going to go through the whole Bible. This was just the first one. We got through about 5-6 pages of the Bible, and we got 1,000 and something to go. So Jamie will be back for all of those.
My Bible's got
unpaid
1,340 pages in it. So there's still quite a way to go.
That's a lot of paid content. So we're going to both make a lot of money. I'll give you a percentage.
Someone's going to get rich.
All right. Thanks, Jamie. We'll do something like this. If people like it, we'll do something like it again if you're free.